material regarding the mollusks. So first let's start with some general background on characteristics that all of the mollusks share, while bearing in mind where we are taxonomically. So remember, these are bilaterally symmetric organisms. We're still within the Protostomia, we are still within the Lophotrochozoa, and phylum Mollusca. So as you can see from some of these images, there is a huge amount of diversity in the phylum Mollusca. The only other phylum that we're going to cover that has nearly as much diversity is the Arthropoda, which is absolutely enormous. But the mollusks are kind of odd because they range from things like chitons, which you're probably not familiar with here, they're mostly on the coast, but things like clams and mussels and oysters and snails and slugs, which seem rather, not that intelligent, all the way up to things like octopi. So there's probably nothing like cuttlefish and octopus that can rival organisms as intelligent. They're just incredibly intelligent, and some of the things that they can do are just incredible. So what are the features that the mollusks share, aside from being an exceptionally diverse group in terms of the morphologies that they exhibit and their general intelligence? Well, this is your first example of an organism that we've covered so far that have a true coelomic cavity. And by the way, I'm pretty sure I made an error in the previous podcast on the rotifers. I think I may have said that they have coelomic cavities, but they don't. They are pseudocoelomates. They're one of the two examples of pseudocoelomates that we're going to see. So I'll send you an email out to correct that. This is your first example of something that has a true coelomic cavity. And this is a major evolutionary innovation, this coelomic cavity. What it does for you is it creates first a space for your organs. So when you looked at the acoelomate condition, those were individuals that had their body cavities full with mesodermal cells or parenchyma cells. What that does is, yes, your organs can still be nestled within them, but because your body is filled up with them, it's going to limit the movements that your body can make. You're somewhat flexible, but bear in mind that most of these acoelomate organisms, they don't have very well developed muscles, and what few muscles they might actually have are attached to the hydrostatic skeleton. So the less space you have in your body, the less space for organs, the less space you have for muscles, and the less dexterity and flexibility of movement you have. When you get to the pseudocoelomate condition, okay, so now you have some muscles, okay, so you have them on the outside of your body cavity, but you don't have them on the inside of your body cavity. So now you have more space for organs and more space for muscles, but you don't have the full complement. So you're approximating, so by virtue of having more space, you can move with more flexibility, and your muscles can attach to the outer portion of your body that serves as the hydrostatic skeleton. But it pales in comparison as to what you can accomplish when you have a full coelomic cavity. So now with a full coelomic cavity, you have space for your organs, you have space for muscles, and now that you have the mesoderm that's in the center of your body, so to speak, so it's around your gut, what that means is you can now develop accessory muscles around the gut, and that's going to facilitate two things. It's going to facilitate digestion. It's going to allow you to actually more efficiently digest your food because those muscles are going to be able to move food through your digestive system. So way more efficiency. You're also going to be able to move fluids around in your body with much greater efficiency. So that's going to include things like a circulatory system when we get to organisms that have them. It's going to talk about moving nutrients around all over, and even eliminating waste is going to become much easier with a true coelomic cavity. So having a true coelomic cavity is a huge evolutionary innovation, and it's going to open up all kinds of avenues for all kinds of adaptations that will follow afterwards. Okay, one difficulty with the mollusks is that they have a really odd body form, unlike other things that you've experienced perhaps. And two major aspects of the body form is what's called a head foot and a visceral mass. So with other animals, we often talk about the subdivisions of the body. So maybe we would talk about the head and the trunk and the foot, right? Or different subdivisions of the body, maybe the torso and the abdomen, right? And then the appendages. These guys, completely different. So the head foot in this example, and I'm showing you some images here of a gastropod, so a snail, and then this bottom picture is meant to be of a bivalve, so a clam you can think, but it's got its top shell removed and it's showing you what's underneath when you remove the shell. So in the mollusks, you're going to see, in some cases, increased cephalization, so what actually looks like a head. But the head is normally going to be directly over that part of the body that serves for locomotion. And since they're so closely connected in space, it's referred to as the head-foot part of the body. Now, in a bivalve, it's hard to see where the head would be, but this structure right here kind of looks like a tongue. That's the foot part of a bivalve. And so they exude that, and it's very muscular, and they can use that to either push themselves through the substrate that they're living on, or in some cases they can actually use it to help them swim, but usually what they're doing is moving their shells to help them swim. So they really don't have a head per se where you can see eyes or sensory organs or even like a brain, but in other mollusks you can see those structures. So in this head-foot region of the body, that part is concerned with feeding. There's a whole lot of sensory organs. So in those that have eyes, you have eye stalks, you have structures that allow for really keen chemosensation and tactile sensation. And then, of course, it's right above the locomotory organs. The other part of the body is what's referred to as the visceral mass. Now, let me take a step back before we get to this. When you're looking at this clam, when you open up the clam or a bivalve, just inside the shell is this structure called the mantle. And you're seeing part of it cut away right here so you can see the gills. But there's a mantle here, and there's a mantle on the bottom shell. Everything in between is the visceral mass. So this includes the digestive organs, and you can see some of them here. So the mouth would be right here. This is a digestive gland. You can see part of the intestines here, leading out and going out towards the anus. So this would be the head region. This would be the tail region, as it were. It includes the reproductive organs, some of which you're seeing down here. It includes muscles that you see here to open and close the shells in the case of this particular mollusk. So everything, all of these organs are enclosed by the mantle, and so the mantle is also part of the visceral mass. So it excludes, the visceral mass does not include the foot or the head region if you have a head region. So to go into this in a little bit more detail, in some mollusks the head region is actually quite well developed, as you see in this snail, this sort of stylized picture of a snail. You know that they have eye stalks, and some other structures, and once we get into, say, like the cephalopods, so the octopi and cuttlefish, they have incredibly well-developed nervous systems, but even the bivalves have really well-developed sensory systems as well, and I'll show you some videos in class. In some cases, they have tentacles, which are, of course, incredibly sensitive for tactile sensation as well as chemosensation. And many, but not all mollusks will feed with what's called a radula. So the radula is this keratinized set of sort of structures that are very tooth-like, and they're usually sitting on a rigid structure called the odontophore. And this is a rasping organ that they use, as you can kind of see here, they stick it out like a tongue, and they use it to rasp out vegetative material that they then consume. And this is a close-up of what the radula looks like in certain mollusks. To give you a sense of what this looks like when they're feeding, there's no sound that goes with this, but this will show you what a functional radula looks like. There you go. So there it is, rasping out algae that's on the side of a fish tank. And by the way, you have a great view right here of the locomotory organ. So this is the foot moving along and kind of moving it along the side of the tank. And it has these sort of fleshy lips around its mouth as well. And there goes the radula again. All right, let's go back to the video, or the slides. Okay. So when we talk about the visceral mass, one structure I want to go into more detail is the mantle. So this is a membrane that lines the shells. Now, as it happens, not all mollusks have a full shell. Some of them have lost it secondarily. In some mollusk species, it's been substantially reduced, so it's there. It's just hard to see. Maybe it's hidden within the body, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. So this protects the soft parts of the organs on the inside of the mollusk, and it houses the respiratory organs. So mollusks can respire with gills, which they normally do have, but they can also respire through their epidermis. So I say here that the outer surface secretes the shell. So basically, the external surface, or the more outside surface of the mantle, that's the structure that actually will secrete the shell, and it will form a number of layers. Now in lab, you'll talk about the various layers of certain kinds of mollusk shells. I'm not really concerned that you know those layers. However, one layer of importance is that which forms pearls. So you're probably, just a moment. So you're probably well aware that pearls are produced naturally in bivalves. And usually this is by virtue of some sort of sand or particulate matter that gets inside the mollusk or inside the bivalve, and it usually gets stuck in between the mantle and the already pre-existing shell. And then over time, the mollusk will lay down layer and layer and layer after layer of this nacreous layer. And so eventually it forms this perfectly circular pearl, which is then harvested for the jewelry industry. What else do I want to tell you? Okay. So this is the first example of a phylum that you've encountered that has a circulatory system. In this case, it's important to bear in mind that there's two forms of circulatory systems. There's what's called an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. An open, well, a closed system is probably easier to conceptualize. It basically consists of a pumping organ, the heart, and then arteries and veins that go out from the heart and it forms a continuous loop. So it leaves the heart, maybe it goes to a respiratory structure to pick up oxygen. It may or may not come back to the heart, goes out to the body, and then eventually does come back to the heart. So it's always enclosed within the circulatory system. An open circulatory system still has arteries and veins, but it's not a full continuous loop. There are gaps. And so sometimes the circulatory fluids will be flowing through body parts, sort of sloshing around as it were. It will get picked back up and sent back to the heart for circulation, but it's allowed to actually float or flow through some parts of the body. And that's what you see in mollusks. So they do have a circulatory system, but it's an open circulatory system. So you can see their heart here. Now this is a stylized diagram, and once again it's of a bivalve, but it basically serves to show how it works for all the mollusks. And so you can see these arteries in red and these veins in blue. So arteries take the blood away, or the circulatory fluid, depending on what it is that you're using. It'll take circulatory fluid away from the heart, and blue usually indicates the unoxygenated circulatory fluid that's coming back to the heart. But there are places where there's gaps in between the arteries and veins. And so the fluid is allowed to kind of slosh around the body parts before it's taken back up by the veins and carried back to the heart to be recirculated once again. So they do have a pumping heart. It's a very simple heart and a very simple pump. There are blood vessels and sinuses. Now as it happens, most of them have an open circulatory system until you get to the cephalopods. So cephalopods have a fully closed system. Now that's actually important to note. So the adaptation for having a circulatory system, what that means is that you're now much more efficient in transporting not only nutrients from food to your body where it's needed for growth or maybe even for reproduction, but you're now able to transport respiratory gases much more efficiently. What that usually indicates is an organism that's much more active So the more active you are, the more oxygen you're going to need to give your cells energy and to be able to move. So the better developed your respiratory system is and your circulatory system is, the more active that you can be, and the longer you can be active. And then, of course, a closed circulatory system is much more efficient than an open circulatory system. And so it's no surprise that cephalopods would have a closed circulatory system because they're incredibly active. And they also have a lot of interesting additional adaptations for their lifestyle that requires a lot of oxygen input. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So the respiratory system, so again, they can respire through their body via diffusion, so specifically through the mantle, through the gills, and in some cases, some mollusks do actually have lungs. They do have a much more complex digestive system as well, and highly specialized compared to some of the organisms we've seen so far. Now this is just an example, once again, of a bivalve, and you can see this digestive organ here. You're going to talk about some additional accessory organs when you get in lab. But once we get to the cephalopods, you'll see that they have a much better developed digestive system. And you're starting to see, remember, up to now, all you've seen is maybe something that's sort of approximating a stomach. You've seen something that sort of approximates the intestines. So the initial breakdown of food, the initial absorption of food. But you really haven't seen a whole lot in the way of specialized organs. So you haven't seen like a liver or a pancreas or a spleen, or any of these other additional organs, bile gland, that helps to break down food products. But now you're starting to see them. They're not highly specialized yet, but they're starting to be developed. You also have a better developed kidney system. So most mollusks do have kidneys. They don't, unlike what you saw, say, with the flatworms, where they open, so you had those flame cells that formed protonephridia that then dumped through pores outside their body, and it was lining their entire body. Now what you have is a closer approximation to a full kidney. So you have special cells that are actually functioning together in a centralized organ, not spread throughout the body. And they actually will dump their waste products either into outside the body through the anus, or they might actually do it into this open portion of the coelomic cavity, which then gets washed out of the body. So to show you that, so this is sort of a stylized picture of a chitin. A chitin is a mollusk that has lots of plated shells on top of it, but it doesn't have any shell underneath. So you can think of it as being maybe like an oyster that only has one shell. And then or you can think of this is also a representation of what you might have with certain kinds of snails as well, snails and slugs. In any case, here's the head region in the mouth. Goes in, here's the stomach. You're starting to see things like the digestive gland, and here's the intestines. Here's the heart, and by the way, this cavity right here is the coelomic cavity. So this is one interesting, unique feature that mollusks have. So they are true coelomates, but they're unusual in that their coelomic cavity has become substantially reduced. So instead of it surrounding the majority of their organs, it only surrounds the heart and a little bit of extra space besides. So that's not usual. There are other animals in the Lophotrochozoa that are coelomates that have larger coelomic cavities. These guys are unique in that it's been reduced. And so here's the kidney, or the nephridium here. And in some cases, the waste will actually dump into the coelomic cavity and then be washed out. In this case, what they're showing you here is it's got an extension that then dumps the waste products into this mantle cavity, and then through water currents it gets washed away from the individual. Their nervous system is variable in the mollusca, but it's much better developed than what we've seen prior to this, so in things like the rotiphores and the flatworms. They have several pairs of ganglia, so you can see these here, these little dark lines here. Here's the nerve collar. Depending on which mollusks you're talking about, they may have a well-developed ganglia or a brain. So the cephalopods have a well-developed brain and well-developed sensory systems. They have an incredible eye that's very adept at seeing everything around them. They also have a nervous system that allows them to change the color and texture of their skin so that they can blend in with their environment, and I'll show you videos of that in class. And then depending on the group that you're talking about, there's a lot of specialized sensory organs that are adaptations to their environments. So these guys are way advanced over rotifers and flatworms. Also, I probably should say they have a much better developed muscular system as well. And so you saw some of those locomotory organs, but cephalopods have those tentacles. They can also locomote with those. They have jet propulsion. Cuttlefish have all kinds of special muscular adaptations. And so in order for those muscles to work so effectively, they need a highly developed nervous system to drive those muscles. When it comes to reproduction, so most of the mollusca are dioecious, so you have males and females that are separated, but there are some that are hermaphroditic, so lots of gastropods are hermaphroditic. When they do reproduce, most of them, especially the ones that are aquatic, often will have free-swimming larvae. They might either have a trochophore-looking larvae like this one, or they might have a veliger larvae that looks like this. And sometimes they'll pass through more than one larval stage. And then many of the bivalves have what's called a glaucidium. So we'll talk more about these in the second podcast as well. But these guys, they're basically little bitty clams, and they almost look like they have little evil teeth on them. And that's because what they do is they actually need a host to complete the larval form of their life, the larval stage of their life. So they'll often attach onto the gills of fish as hosts and absorb nutrients from their gills until they reach a certain stage, and then they drop off and settle down and then begin to grow into a full-blown adult. So let's talk about the economic importance, or the general importance even, of the mollusks. So as you know, these many species of mollusks are consumed by people around the world. So this is just a picture from the web that shows you some mussels here. There's some additional other kinds of mussels on this side. Now these are shrimp and these are not mollusks, so don't get confused. But there are some calamari that are right here. So if you've ever had calamari, those are just fried up little pieces of squid, little bitty squids. They're yummy. There's of course escargot, which is just snails, and in this case they're in a sort of garlic pesto sauce, which is delicious. As you know, lots of people eat oysters, raw or cooked. Got to be careful with them though. And then these are scallops, which are the adductor muscles of specific mollusk species. So all of these are consumed around the world, along with all kinds of other species. So even octopus is eaten. It's a multi-million-dollar industry, probably a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so what that means is that a lot of money can be made by consuming these organisms, but it's important to sustainably harvest them as well. Because if we don't, we're going to lose them as an industry. And so a lot of people will lose their jobs. And for those that like to eat that stuff, they're going to lose that as a source of food. And there are some indigenous peoples around the world that actually depend upon these organisms to survive. They are also the source of a multi-billion-dollar industry in the jewelry. So of course they're used to produce pearls. There's particularly in Japan, they're really adept at farming pearls and producing pearls from bivalves. And they've often been used for all kinds of forms of jewelry, including buttons. So this is an image that's one of many similar images that's been also taken right here in Michigan, where they're literally sitting on a mountain of shells right here that have been harvested from mussels and bivalves throughout the lakes in Michigan and the surrounding Great Lakes region. So they would harvest these from the rivers and tributaries. They would drill holes in them to produce these buttons. They drill as many holes as they could, get as many buttons out of each shell as they could, and then toss it to the side and grab another. A lot of species have been extirpated as a result of the button industry, and most buttons, of course, are now produced synthetically out of plastic. But they're still, mollusks are still used today for all kinds of forms of jewelry. And ecologically, they're hugely important. So there's both bad, if you will, mollusks and good mollusks, or maybe bad impacts and good impacts, I guess I should say. This image right here is a map, and this is just from 2010, and it's showing the extent of the zebra and quagga mussel invasion in the United States. Now, mind you, this is 7 years old now. It's an old map, and so the extent of their invasion is significantly greater. However, it's important to note that they're hugely impactful here in Michigan. They can cause a lot of damage. They can cloud up pipes. They can encrust motorboats and propellers and all kinds of equipment throughout the Great Lakes. And they've created an enormous amount of damage, so physical damage to structures of all kinds. If you were to take a camera and go to look at the floor of any of the Great Lakes, you will see that most of them are carpeted with zebra or quagga mussels. They're quite small. They're very small, but they're incredibly prolific. They can reproduce hundreds and hundreds of individuals every year, and they're quite adaptive. Like they're pretty hardy organisms. They've also, while it turns out we have a lot of diversity in native mollusk species in the Great Lakes region, they've been quite damaging to them as well. They'll actually settle out and live on the shells of larger native mussels. And when they do that, what happens is they basically filter feed and get all of the planktonic resources before the larger native mussel can eat. And so what that means is they end up actually starving out the native mussels. So they're, of course, a great concern to environmentalists as well as to pretty much everyone around the Great Lakes. Interestingly, all mollusks, including the zebra mussels, they're great filters of water. They can filter through many gallons of water an hour, and as a result, what they often do is they filter out all kinds of pollutants as well, which is probably why you wouldn't want to eat any Great Lakes mollusks. But they do an incredible job at filtering the water. And so what I'm showing you here is an image taken where after 3 hours the mussels have greatly improved the water clarity to nearly transparent, and I've seen it look even better. And as it happens, if you go and look at the Great Lakes, as a result of the zebra and quagga mussels, the water clarity in the Great Lakes is vastly better than it was before they were ever even introduced. So you would think in part that that would be a good thing. And in some measure it actually is, because they do actually filter out quite a lot of pollutants. However, there's much greater filtering of the water going on now than there was in the past. And that's created a little bit of a problem from the standpoint of how it impacts algal blooms. So what's happening now is so much of the particulate matter in the water is being filtered out that light, or sunlight in particular, is allowed to penetrate much more deeply into the water column. And that means algae that are at the bottom are able to photosynthesize at a much higher rate. Because of that, they are able to grow at a much greater rate. And so they end up forming these giant mats that float to the surface of the water, and they then get blown in to the shoreline all around the Great Lakes. And so as a result, on the one hand, that creates more nutrients for all kinds of organisms, but it also creates this giant, ooky, disgusting mat all along the beaches and along people's homes. It also has the tendency to actually crowd out some of the fish and microorganisms and invertebrates that live along the shoreline. So there's this interesting food web interaction where there are positive impacts and there are negative impacts. It's definitely the case that it's not the way the environment was 100 years ago. We're never going to get back there, although there are great improvements that are happening. What's probably going to happen is that we'll eventually reach this stable state that's a new state, different from what we had before. But we're still working our way towards that. And researchers studying around the Great Lakes are searching for ways to try to manage all of these invasive species and deal with the impacts of those species. Okay, that's enough of a soapbox for that. So that's all I'm going to say in this first podcast. I'll continue talking about the classification and taxonomy of the mollusca and the specific groups that we're going to talk about as examples of the mollusca in the next podcast. See you later, and happy mollusking.